Today, we will be discussing volunteer retention by breaking that down into 3 stages of engaging your volunteers. First, we'll talk about recruiting and onboarding volunteers. Second, we'll go through identifying volunteer trends and reaching out to volunteers who may be slipping through the cracks. Third, and lastly, we'll talk about how to celebrate your volunteers and communicate their impact. We're very excited about this webinar as we are passionate about volunteerism and helping you make the most of your service database to engage and care for your volunteers. And we have a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. Now, I want to start off by saying that every organization is different, and I would encourage you, as we're discussing, to apply the lens of your process to what we're covering today. And of course, like I mentioned at the top, if you have any specific needs or questions, don't hesitate to ask in the chat throughout the call, or of course by emailing our customer support team at support@servicetech.com. Now, we did cover the process of streamlining volunteer registrations in a recent webinar, and I would encourage you to review that. So again, if you go to video.servicetech.com, that'll take you to our YouTube channel. And we went through a webinar recently called Streamlining Volunteer Registrations. The focus of that webinar was how do you update your website? How do you direct your volunteers to make sure that you're presenting to volunteers what they are interested in and providing clear paths. So again, I'd encourage you to review that. That does have some good information. But today I want to focus on a couple other subjects within that realm. So we're going to talk about a couple different things that you can do to help your volunteers initially as they're engaging with you as a part of that kind of retention process. So in addition to having a clear path on your website that volunteers can follow, as we discussed in that webinar, it's very important to set expectations well by describing your opportunities. All right, so this can take a number of different forms, but one of the biggest things that you can do is make sure that when you create your opportunities, you provide for volunteers information about the task itself, right? So what will volunteers be doing? What should they expect as a part of that task? What kind of requirements are in place, especially if you have any restrictions? It's good to over-communicate that kind of thing so that volunteers know ahead of time, before they get rejected, hey, these restrictions are in place. What qualifications are required, or what do they need to bring? What do they need to wear? All that kind of information is just vital to over-communicate to your volunteers so that they have clear expectations on the outset. Before they're even looking at times, what does this role entail and how, are they going to be serving with you and what's going to be required of them? One of the things that can be very important about this is including an image. Including an image on your opportunities says a lot. Famous saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. If somebody looks at an image like this, they can immediately identify, okay, we're going to be standing, we're sorting things, we're working in a group setting, it's not alone. They immediately get a lot of information about the opportunity itself. So I think including images of your volunteers in process, whether or not they're professional images, is an important thing to do so that volunteers can get a quick idea of what they will be doing within that task. So again, the idea here, describing to volunteers what they will be doing, what the expectations are, making sure it's clear before they attend what's going to be happening is a way to ensure that you're recruiting quality volunteers who know what to expect and know what they'll be doing. So in Service, I just want to point out briefly, if you're logged in on the admin side, where you do this, right? So you should have created an event by now, and of course you've seen the description section. This is where this takes place. Now you can just include text in here directly, but what I might encourage you to do is to create a robust description that you can reuse as some sort of template. So volunteers can kind of get used to looking at your events in a certain manner. So if we look at this event that we were just kind of showcasing on the volunteer side, if we go into update this opportunity, You can see here this opportunity has, these different headings and sections, and there's different formatting that's been applied here to make this look kind of stand out and easy to read. Something you could do with this is save this field content and call this your description template. And then anytime you create a new event, you can reuse that template. So if we go in and I go and create a new opportunity now, I don't have to go and figure out all of the template functions that I used or all of the different kind of formatting that I applied to that opportunity. We can just go in here and say load field content, pick from that list. You can see it's already saved here, but if we pick from that list, we can load that up, and that essentially just pulls in that information. And of course, I'll want to make changes to this if this event is unrelated, but now I have my template, and so I don't have to go and redo all that formatting. The other portion of this that we talked about was adding an image. When you add an image to an opportunity, that's done after you've created the opportunity. So again, once it's in this listing here, you can search for it by name. But once I click on the name of the opportunity here, on the right-hand side, there's an icon for the image. If you've already added an image, that's what you'll see here. But either way, you can click to view or update the event photo. There's also an inline option for that here with a generic image icon. And this just takes you to a page where you can pick an image from your computer and add that to the event itself. Okay, so again, just to recap that, presenting to your volunteers concise information, but also all of the data that they need about the events themselves is an important part of initially recruiting volunteers so that you've set the stage. They know what the expectations are, they know what they'll be doing, so they kind of have a better idea of what's going to happen. And that's a good way to keep volunteers around by making sure they know before they even attend, what's going to be happening. And some volunteers might not really care, and they might just see the name, the picture, and that's enough for them, and they sign up. But it's okay that all this extra information is included because there are some volunteers that do want to see this information. Okay, the next kind of point in this regard in terms of how you initially recruit volunteers is making sure that there's always something for a volunteer to do. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have shifts that are always posted. Certainly, some things are seasonal and you don't always need to be recruiting volunteers for different capacities. And things can fill up, and that's okay if that's the case. I'm not saying that you always have to be recruiting actively volunteers for specific positions. What I'm saying is there should be some action that a volunteer could take in your system if they're interested in working with you. And again, that doesn't mean necessarily that you have an open position, but what it means is there's something for them to click on. There's some way for them to give you their information and get on your radar. And that can take a couple different forms. One thing is you might have a standing orientation. Maybe you do an orientation once a month and you just always have that posted. So if someone's interested in learning more, whether or not there are available shifts, you have an orientation upcoming and they can sign up for that. So you could have a time slot event that's pinned at the top like this, and they can always go and sign up for that orientation. Right? At least in this scenario, they're giving you their information and there's something that they can come and attend. Another example, maybe you don't want to host orientations, totally understandable. Maybe you can't do that, but you still want to collect volunteer information. You could have a standing service project that functions as a form of application, or you could just point volunteers directly to the application page itself. This gets into a little bit more the idea of how you onboard volunteers, specifically kind of that idea of do you need to vet volunteers as they're applying, or is this a situation where you just want to collect their information, right? So that kind of gets into a bit of a deeper conversation, but having one of those two things available for volunteers, either your application page just posted directly so that if a volunteer doesn't see something that they're interested in or that's available, they can at least create a profile with you. I think that's important to include. Now, in my example here, I've included a button on the right-hand side where volunteers can click to create a profile if they want to. But I often encourage including that link in this. It's not a description section, in this welcome message for your event listing page. You could have a blurb in here that says, "Don't see something you're interested in, click here to create a profile, to make sure you're informed." Some kind of language like that, where you're giving a volunteer something to do, even if there's nothing else to do for them right now. Now, the way you edit this description section or this welcome message, if you would like to, is, of course, in your system, log in as an administrator. There is, under system management, you have your system configuration, and one of the sections in here is page content. And this section contains your event listing page welcome message. So if we wanted to have, click here to create a profile and get notifications or something like that, you could create that through here. You can create links in here, so you can insert a link to your application page. And again, we're getting a little bit more into that idea of, how do you embed service into your website? So if you have questions about that process, again, the webinar we did recently on streamlining registrations talks about a lot of the theory. But if you need help technically, we have articles that talk about, okay, how do you embed those different pages? Where do you get those links? One of those articles is titled Integrating Service into Your Existing Website. So whenever you're logged in, if you use the Need Help button at the bottom of the page, you can search for integrating or website. Any of those kinds of terms will pull up this document. And this contains all of those instructions. So kind of all of the technical instructions. Personally, I prefer to pop these out. I just think they're easier to read that way. But that includes things like links to your application page. Down towards the bottom, you'll see in here links for the application page, things like that. And again, if you have more specific questions about this and how it works with your organization and how you want to direct volunteers, we do also offer a free 30-minute web integration meeting where we could walk through together, how do you embed service into your website and how are you directing volunteers? So again, a bit of a different conversation, but going back to this point, it's important that when your volunteers arrive on your website, when you're directing them to see what's available, even if there's not something that they can do today or sign up for today, there should be some way for them to give you their information. And again, that could be an orientation, it could be the application page, or it could be more of like a general interest form for a particular program. Okay. The next kind of idea in this vein is, how do you streamline additional signups? So if a volunteer has already attended one event, how do they sign up for another event? And a lot of that has to do with web integration as well, and that webinar on streamlining registrations. But something I might suggest is enabling the thank you message for certain events, not necessarily all of your events. But in your system, you have the option to turn on an automated thank you email. So in the system configuration, there's a section called email message content. And in here, you can write out an event participation thank you message. There's an intro here. This is the subject. And then, of course, you have the message itself. So you can see this is not going to have any of the data from the event. This is just going to be a generic thank you message. But what I would do is keep this kind of short and sweet and direct people to where they can sign up for another shift or see other events that they might be interested in. You could have sections in here pointing people towards, family-friendly events or group-friendly events, but something like that gives the volunteer the ability for them to go and sign up for another event. So this is something I might encourage you to do, is to turn on thank you messages for certain events. If you have data in here, let me go ahead and update this in my configuration. When you create an opportunity, you will see for that opportunity, do you want to send the automatic thank you email? So again, every event has this as an option, and you can say, yes, everyone who was registered, or only people who had signed in. So there's different ways to use this message. And again, I wouldn't use it all the time, but for certain events, I think it's a useful tool, and it gives volunteers a pipeline for coming back. Another thing to consider in terms of volunteers participating more than once is, how are your events structured? So a lot of times it might be tempting when you're creating opportunities in service to just go and create a normal event. And then if you have another version of that event, go and create another normal event. But that can create a lot of clutter and a lot of different basically stacked events, the same sort of thing occurring over and over again. So if you can, it's often better to use time slot events to create your opportunities so that you can have multiple instances of the same type of shift in one place. That way, if a volunteer wants to, they can sign up for more than one shift at the same time. So you can kind of initially capture volunteers for more than one instance right away. We can see this example with that sort and repack event that I've showed a couple times now. So if we go and look at this event, this is a time slot event. It occurs 5 days a week. And if someone wants to, when they are signing up, they can pick more than one shift. So when they click to register and go through that process, the system will present them with a checklist, and they can go through and pick to sign up for more than one shift if they would like to. So using time slot events makes it very easy for volunteers to sign up for additional shifts. Okay, something else to consider kind of in this vein, and we're going to come back to this topic more a little bit later, is how you email your volunteers. Things like newsletters, or are you posting about new shifts that you've created, or are you sending basically links to your volunteers to sign up for new upcoming opportunities, and kind of how are you communicating with your volunteers? So not to give you an additional webinar to go and review, but we did do a webinar also this year on all things email and how emailing works in service. If you need an idea of kind of how it functions and how to actually send emails and create your templates and that sort of thing, that's what this webinar is for. But what I want to talk about today is in your database, identifying sets of volunteers and sending them emails. So actually kind of in this vein, we're going to switch gears here to talking about how do you identify volunteers that might be slipping through the cracks. So obviously getting people to sign up initially, very important, but retaining people from 1 year to the next, 1 month to the next, that's a different beast. And trying to identify those sets of volunteers is certainly a good place to start. So there are a lot of tools in Service to help you accomplish this. The majority of those are in the volunteer database side. So for example, you might use the advanced volunteer search to find sets of volunteers who could potentially be slipping through the cracks. Now, what you might define as volunteers slipping away can vary, and it depends on what your expectations are for your volunteers, what you might search for. But if we look in the advanced volunteer search, there's a section in here I want to point out a little bit specifically today, and that's participation options. In here, you can find volunteers based on participation. So you can find volunteers with more than, exactly, less than, or between a certain number of times or hours or impact tracking metrics between certain dates. So for example, I could go in here and say, find someone who served at least one time or more than 0 times in 2023, right? So I could set a date range here of basically all of 2023 and find volunteers that served at least one time in that calendar year, right? So this is more than 0 times served in 2023. And once I run that search, okay, these are all the people that worked with me last year. Let's say I want to take that group and narrow it down to people who have not yet registered with me this year. So I can go back into the advanced search and we can go back into participation options and we can say, okay, of that group, let's find people with exactly 0 registrations this year. So whenever I do a search like this, I always like to forecast. So even though we're in October now, I'm recruiting for events in December. So I might like to say, find people who have not signed up for anything into December yet, right? So people who worked with me last year who haven't yet worked with me this year. Now, a very important part of this particular search, if I just run this right now, I'm kind of overriding my previous search. But if we scroll down to the bottom, in the advanced volunteer search, there's an advanced options section. And in here, I can say, hey, combine the results of this pending search with my previous results. And this is effectively telling Service, take my results from my previous search. I want to search within those. So now if I click on Search Volunteer Database, I'm identifying volunteers who participated at least one time last year, but have not yet registered for anything this year. Right, so this can be a good pool of people if you're trying to target a specific email. Maybe you want to identify those volunteers and then send them a more targeted email about, having participated last year, and maybe you'd be interested in this year. So that's kind of the purpose of running a search like that, is to have a more targeted email campaign. But one thing I'd like to point out, sometimes it's best not to hamstring your emails like that, and instead just email your whole database, right? It's okay to email your whole database and say, we've got these seasonal events coming up. We think you might be interested in this. And again, one of the things I pointed out earlier too, it can be useful in those kinds of emails to include more specific invites. Like, for example, you could say, here are a list of events that are family friendly upcoming, or here are a list of events that are friendly for corporate partners or groups, and target those kinds of sets of volunteers, and just basically invite them by those kinds of more direct kind of invites or more specific information, rather than just saying, click here to see everything that we're doing upcoming. I think it's appropriate to do that sometimes as well, but you can kind of weigh that, especially depending on who you're emailing. Okay, now something else I wanted to talk about in terms of identifying volunteers who might have slipped through the cracks. If we go back into the advanced search, you can find volunteers in Service by a few other metrics that are pretty useful in this realm. One of those things is under account status options. You can find volunteers based on when their profile was created. So for example, maybe you want to find a volunteer who made their profile this year, but have not actually signed up for anything yet, right? So I want to find someone who's created a profile between January 1st and today. And if we go down to participation options, then I can say, and also they have no registrations. Now, in this case, I could put a date range in here, or I could leave it off. In this case, I would leave it off. So now I'm looking for new volunteers who have not yet signed up for anything. Now, maybe including through today isn't necessarily the best look, because maybe they just made a profile and they're going to come back. So maybe we want to go through yesterday, or we want to go through the start of this month, but that's up to you. You can kind of tune this as you need to, and then essentially locate a set of volunteers who might have, initially expressed interest. They filled out an application, but they haven't actually participated yet. And again, this is just a way to identify a set of volunteers, and then you can take that set and you can email them through Service. So you can send an email here. And again, if you want to learn more about creating templates and how emailing works in Service, we have a webinar on the technical side of that. Or sometimes you might want to take this list and then just export it. So for example, you could go in here and download a spreadsheet, or download more specific information if you're just looking to send out like a mailer, things like that. Okay, one other aspect of kind of engaging volunteers who might be slipping through the cracks is incentivizing volunteers to return. So it's worth considering how you might incentivize volunteers to come back through different kind of methods, right? This could be things like seasonal offerings. Maybe you have some special events that people might be really interested in that they're just not aware of. So just even emailing about special events like that is a lot of times an incentive in itself. But you can also do things, of course, like creating t-shirts for volunteers or offering t-shirts for special events. Another thing that you could do is create some kind of raffle for volunteers who participate within a single month. In Service, you can readily create an award that volunteers can earn on a monthly basis for having participated at least one time that month. So you could run a search for volunteers who earned this award this month or last month, and then essentially do a raffle based on that, right? You can export that to a spreadsheet, find a random number, and then do a raffle using that kind of information. So this kind of award is something that if we just look at the title, this says monthly raffle entry entered into the raffle for participating at least once this month. Volunteers will see this data, and of course they'll see this. So that on their profile, they'll see every time they get this badge. But then this can be earned once per month. So you can see here on the right-hand side, it says 1 times monthly, which is the assignment. So when I created that award, I went up here and I said for the award assignment, I want this to be doled out anytime someone participates at least 1 time within a single month. You can do the same kind of thing on an annual basis as well. And this can be turned into a pretty effective metric for finding volunteers who work with you consistently. You can find like how many times they've earned this yearly badge or monthly badge, right? But this award essentially can be earned once per month. And then you can go into your volunteer database, use the advanced search, and you can say, show me anyone who earned that award more than 0 times or more than 5 times. If you want to maybe give people awards based on, having participated X number of months. Or if you're doing a raffle like I am in this case, I can say, show me anybody with more than one of these for the month of September, right? So they participated at least 1 time in September, and so they have that award. Now, there's different ways to run that kind of search as well. But if you have an award for it, volunteers get that badge on their profile as well. Okay, there's one last aspect to kind of identifying and engaging with retention in service, and that would be a report that is specifically in report management called volunteer retention. So report number 7, if we go into report management, is the volunteer retention report. You can apply queries to this report so that you're only looking at certain aspects of the database, maybe a certain set of volunteers or a certain set of opportunities, but you can also use this for your entire database. And so this basically just allows you to get numbers on kind of attendance and how much people stick around. So if we run this report, it creates a spreadsheet. So if you run that, it'll download a spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet basically just looks like this. So it'll tell you it's a retention report when it was run, and then it gives you years, active volunteers, and then percentage kind of retention. So what we're looking at here is for this year. So if we look at this first year, 2019, we had 1,979 active volunteers. That's the number of people who participated within this year. And then in 2020, 28% of those came back. In 2021, 19 almost percent of those came back, right? So we're looking at this number, these people from 2019, how many of them came back in 2022? How many of these people came back in 2023 or in 2024, right? So you can kind of get an idea of how long volunteers are sticking around based on this base year. The cumulative retention number on the right-hand side gives you not a sum of these percentages, but instead a total of these people, how many of them came back at least 1 year. So that's what this number represents over here. So, of course, we get this for other years as well. This report essentially goes back 5 years and tells us these values, and how people are coming back and how many people are coming back. So you can kind of get ideas of the tendencies of volunteers to come back from 1 year to the next. So again, you can run this report for your whole database. That was that example, but you can also run it for a specific set. Maybe you really care about a particular program. So you can run that by a certain set of opportunities. You could go into your opportunity database, search for a set of opportunities by a tag or by a keyword, or perhaps by like an interest category. And then you can identify, instead of all of your volunteer database, okay, how is this program doing? And how are we doing retaining volunteers within that program? So you can run a search, go back into report management, and then apply that query. So you're only looking at a particular set of your database rather than your entire volunteer database. Okay, and again, the point of this report is just to give you an idea on trends. It's not giving you volunteer names, it's just giving you percentages. If you would like to pull the names of these people, you can. You can use the advanced searches that we looked at earlier. You can find volunteers who create a profile, started working in 2019. You can actually run a search for volunteers whose first activity was in 2019. So if we go back into the advanced volunteer search, under participation options, you can find volunteers that have participated in or will participate in their first activity. So I could go in here and set this to 2019 and say, okay, show me everyone whose first activity was in 2019, and then apply another filter for people of that group who served more than 0 times in 2020. Right. So if you want those numbers and you want to actually see the people and engage them directly, you can run searches to pull that. This report is just kind of pulling together the data cumulative so you can see, those trends. Okay, we have one more important subject for today regarding retention, and that would be celebrating your volunteers. We kind of touched on this a little bit already. Part of celebrating your volunteers is just communicating with them, right? Emailing volunteers and letting them know what their contributions have done, right? Running your own reports and seeing how many hours your volunteers have contributed, how many impact tracking metrics, those different kind of numbers that they've done, the different things that they've done within your community, and then letting them know what their contributions have actually valued to. Right, letting them know what they've done as an organization, what you are doing, and how they've been helping with that. Right, so that's kind of part of just celebrating your volunteers, is including them in your celebration of what you've been doing. So running reports, sending emails, again, that's all kind of part of that conversation. And I hate to keep deferring to other webinars, but we do have other webinars on how to run reports. And again, about how to send emails as well. So those are good references if you need kind of more of the technical side of how to run those reports. But one other way that you can celebrate volunteers, apart from just informing them about numbers and giving that information via newsletters, things like that, would be to create awards. And again, we've talked about this a little bit now. And again, we do have a webinar on all the technical side of creating awards. But what awards are intended to do is to offer to your volunteers essentially badges or stickers. So when a volunteer earns an award, they will see that when they log in. So when a volunteer next logs in, whether they're at home signing up for another event, or if they're using the sign-in console, they'll see a badge or a banner like this that tells them, hey, congratulations, here's the award you most recently earned. And this will stay here until they acknowledge it. So right, if they click on it or if they click on this X to close it out. So of course, you want your awards to be descriptive and tell them why did they get this award? What does it actually mean? But yeah, this is essentially to celebrate your volunteers. So if we go back to the admin side here, in the award inventory management, you can create awards that span different concepts. If we look at the examples I have set up here, I give out awards based on years of service. This is essentially how old their accounts are in the system. It's not necessarily that they have engaged within those years. It's just that they've been with us this long. There's other ways to find awards or to create awards rather that would tell you like how many years they've worked with you, right? So this yearly participation, I can search for volunteers in my system based on how many of this award they have to identify people who've served at least 5 years, whether or not they're consecutive, right? So you can do things like that if you want to. So this is more for your own benefit and your own metrics. And then, of course, I might email those people and let them know that they're on a certain list or things like that. But yeah, so you can create awards that are based on years of service. You can create awards that are based on lifetime milestones. So reaching certain numbers of hours or certain numbers of times served with you. So there's different ways to kind of create those sorts of metrics. You can also create awards that are doled out annually. So people can re-earn these every year or monthly. And again, we talked about that with like this raffle entry as well. So they can re-earn these every single calendar month. And then you can also create special awards. And I think that this is an important thing to do as well. to be able to identify volunteers who, have gone above and beyond, or kind of identify those volunteers who you want to point out and single out. So doing this aspect of the work, creating these awards, is a very individual way to acknowledge those people because they see those awards on their profile. But I think it's also important to then email your database or host some kind of awards banquet where you can then identify those volunteers who are kind of like your super volunteers, whether it's some kind of metric like how many years they've been with you, or if it's people who, are really consistent, they come at least once a month kind of thing, and they've done that 50 months in a row, or, something like that. So identifying those volunteers and then also celebrating them with your database as a whole, emailing all your volunteers and pointing those people out and celebrating their accomplishments, I think is an important thing to do in terms of just engaging and celebrating volunteers so that they see, that their contributions are recognized. Okay. And of course, there's a lot of different ways that you can choose to engage that. And on a per organization basis, that's going to be very different. You might not have the capability to host some kind of physical banquet, but, perhaps you can send out an email newsletter that recognizes those people, right? So it kind of depends on where you're at and how you want to engage with those people. There's one last aspect to celebrating your volunteers that I want to point out. And again, if you have questions about the technical aspect of this, please let us know. But in Service, you do have access to a widget that you could post on your website. You might also include this via emails if you wanted to, but essentially this is a way for you to kind of keep volunteers up to speed on kind of how their contributions are affecting your community. So this is something that you can modify. You can change the look of it a little bit in terms of the colors and the language that's being presented and the date range of the data that's being included, or whether it's just a certain program that you're including here. So there's ways to modify this. And if you have questions about that, please let us know. But this is something that could be included. I mean, right now I have this as a standalone just to kind of preview it, but this is something that you can include on your website or that you can use to point volunteers to their contributions. All right. And like I said, if you have questions about this or any of the technical kind of sides that we didn't dive into today, please feel free to ask away through our customer support team. We are so grateful for all of the work that you are all doing. We're just grateful that we get to operate with the different organizations that are represented here. I know I've met with a lot of you personally, so thank you for joining. If you do have any questions about what we covered today regarding volunteer retention or how the different tools in Service can help you identify sets of volunteers and communicate with those volunteers, or really just kind of capture their hearts with the work that you're doing, if you have more questions about that, please feel free to ask away. A lot of the questions we've gotten so far have been pretty specific, so we're not going to address any of those as a larger group, but I am going to leave the webinar open here for a bit in case you do have further questions, so feel free to ask away. Or of course, you can always use our customer support tool for that as well. So thank you again so much for joining. It's a pleasure to engage with all of you throughout these webinars, and we look forward to meeting again with you next month.